In the hills above Dewsbury, where the River Calder winds between soot-streaked terraces and the scent of coal smoke lingers in the air, lies the village of Thornhill. By the 1890s, this was no longer a land of lords and labourers, it was coal country, and coal meant survival. Steam engines roared across Britain, mills thundered, ships needed fuelling, towns were growing fast, and the hunger for coal was insatiable. Here in Thornhill, almost every family had someone working down the pit. Fathers, sons, brothers, even boys barely into double figures. Each morning before sunrise, the village stirred to the familiar rhythm. Clacking lunch tins, boots scuffing the cobbles, quiet prayers murmured in doorways. The colliery yard echoed with the sound of hobnails on stone, coughs cutting through the cold air, and the low hum of the cage being ready to drop them into the dark. Combs Colliery was different though, or so people believed. There'd been no fatal explosions here, no disasters, no need to fear. And so, on an average Tuesday morning, 146 men and boys descended into the weekly scene. Some were seasoned colliers, others were just starting out, all of them doing what generations had done before, shoveling, hauling, hammering their way through rock for the fuel that kept Britain alive. But that day, something waited in the depths, something that would steal the breath from Thornhill's lungs. And chillingly, it happened on the very same date. The children of the Husker Pit, from our very first episode, lost their lives underground. 55 years to the day, the 4th of July, again. Hello friends and welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, I'm Claire and this is the Wanderlust way. Firstly, let me say thank you to everybody that supports this channel by liking, commenting, subscribing and sharing. It allows me to bring you on more adventures and share stories like this with you. So today we are at the third and final episode of those Yorkshire's worst pit disasters in the 19th century. We started this series at the Husker Pit in 1838 with the loss of 26 children. We then moved on last week to Barnsley, to the Oaks Colliery, where over 360 men and boys lost their lives in a tragedy there in 1866. Today we are 55 years on from that first tragedy in the village of Thornhill to commemorate a disaster that happened. 65 women lost their husbands and over 230 children became fatherless overnight. Now this disaster was significant, not only because after all those years changes had been made, lessons had been learned and safety measures were in place, but that things like this were still happening and the cost of coal was still significant. Once again, this isn't going to be an easy story to share, but I do feel it's an important one. So please join me as we come together and remember the boys and the men of the Combs. That is enough waffle, let's wander. It was a Tuesday, the 4th of July 1893. And in the mining village of Thornhill, West Yorkshire, a place built on black seams and harder lives, the day began like any other. The boots of 146 men and boys struck the cobbles before sunrise. Mothers packed lunch tins, young lads followed their older brothers or neighbours down the lanes. No fuss, no words wasted, just a nod, a glance and off they went, same as always. They were heading to the Combs Colliery. To many, the Combs was a good place to work, a model pit people called it. It was said to have a set out on the very best principles regardless of cost. Clean, organised, well ventilated, no major incidents, no great explosions. We're now at St Mary's Church in Mirfield, which is just a few miles away from where the Combs Colliery site is. And we're here at Mr Edward T Ingham's grave. Well, this is the actual family plot of the Inghams. Now the Inghams were a coal family and they sunk the Combs pit back in 1875. Now, unlike a lot of the coal kings, shall we call them, that were in this area at the time, Edward Ingham was quite well liked. It was said that the colliers quite respected him, and he even used to call a lot of them by their Christian names, which was very, very unheard of at that time. That morning, the cage dropped nearly 380 yards down the drawing shaft into the Wheatley seam, the only seam being worked that day. Seams were often given names, some after local landmarks, others after family. In this case, it was said the Wheatley seam was named after Ingham's wife, a personal touch in an otherwise industrial world. It was what they called a wet pit. Water seeped in constantly, dampening coal dust and, in theory, making it safer. The men used safety lamps as standard, Davy lamps designed to shield flame from gas, but not all the light below ground was so carefully contained. In certain areas, porchways and lamp stations for example, naked paraffin flames were still in use. It was allowed though, it was normal. Now, before we go any further, there is something we must discuss about mines, and that is the air. The air down in the mines wasn't just heavy, it could be deadly. And it's very easy, if you're not from a mining community, to think that it's just a case of picking out a bit of rock and taking it to the surface. But underground, it was a difficult world, and a dangerous one at that. In almost every coal mine, one threat loomed larger than most: gas. Invisible, odourless, silent, but devastating. The most feared was fire damp, a term miners used to describe pockets of methane gas that could build up in the air. Methane seeps naturally out of coal seams, and in the confined, poorly ventilated spaces of mines, it can collect quickly. All it takes is a single spark, and fire damp becomes a fireball. And that is why the invention of the Davy lamp was so important. Obviously, it didn't stop the collection of gas, but it did help prevent those explosions. The Davy lamp was invented in 1815 by Sir Humphrey Davy. It used a simple but clever design. The flame was enclosed inside a fine metal gauze. The gauze allowed light and air to pass through, but it cooled the flame so much that it couldn't ignite any gas on the outside. It wasn't perfect, but it saved lives. By the time of the Combs disaster in 1893, these Davy-style safety lamps were standard issue for most miners. Now here's the part that might shock you. Despite these safety lamps being available and widely used, naked flames were still allowed in certain areas of the mine. In theory, places like lamp stations and porchways were always well ventilated, considered safe enough for open flames. Paraffin lamps with their bright naked flames gave off better light than Davy lamps. They were easier to work by, cheaper to maintain, and frankly people got used to them. But safety often comes second to routine, and in pits like the Combs, those naked flames were still flickering in the dark, even while fire damp lingered just out of sight. The shift began at 6 a.m, the only shift of that day. But by lunchtime, the earth beneath Thornhill would be torn apart, and the village would never be the same. The shift was made up of 73 goal-getters, 40 hurriers, boys and young lads hauling heavy tubs of coal, 24 rope-end lads, 4 pit-bottomed men, a blacksmith, and 4 officials including the under-manager. Among them were 57 boys, some just 12 years old. It was midday, the dinner hour, some were eating, others were working through, and just after 12 o'clock it happened. A dull, thunderous boom echoed from the earth. People near the shafts heard it clearly, a strange, heavy sound that seemed to roll up from the pit itself, and then the silence. In the village, everything stopped in its tracks. Housewives dropped their pots and pans, children stopped playing, and everybody turned towards the pit. One witness described it as being louder than thunder. The explosion had come from deep within the Wheatley seam, near a fault line known to leak small pockets of methane. It wasn't unexpected, gas had been reported there before, but never in worrying amounts. William Scott, just 35 years old, had been manager for 2 months, but a miner for 20 years, and he responded immediately. But what he found was worse than anything he could have imagined. The explosion wasn't the only danger. In fact, many of those who died that day weren't burned at all. It was afterdamp, the deadly cocktail of gases left behind after a mine blast, that did the most damage. To those still alive underground, the air itself had turned lethal. Survivors would later speak of a white mist, something unnatural, drifting through the tunnels, snuffing out light as it went. The explosion took the flame, but the afterdamp, well, it took the breath. One of the last men to go down the shaft before the explosion was James Scargill. He never came back up alive. Scott and a group of men made 2 attempts to reach the workings. Each time they were forced to return, overwhelmed by smoke, gas and heat. As they reached the surface after the second descent, they were overtaken by a massive cloud of smoke. The crowd watched, shrieking in terror. Still, news was spreading fast, and the people of Thornhill came running. A picture which I found at the National Coal Mining Museum shows what happened next. By the early afternoon, the area was crowded. By nightfall, 20,000 people were said to have gathered in and around the Combs site. Many stood silently, others wept. The explosion had torn through the mine, and now families stood above ground, staring down into the earth, were hoping for a miracle, but fearing the worst. Beneath them there were still men alive, and like the Combs Colliery disaster in 1866, what followed next would become another example of the heroic rescue efforts in Yorkshire's mining history. Efforts were made to pump water into the mine, not to save lives but to stop the flames. But by nightfall, everyone assumed that no one could have survived. Edward Ingham, the mine's owner, had been in Limerick Island when the news reached him. He travelled through the night, arriving back at Thornhill at around 4 a.m. He later said the words "widows and orphans" echoed through his mind for every mile of that journey. What awaited him at the pit, though, was worse than he could have imagined. I read a quote from Ingham in the Dewsbury Reporter. He said the scenes at Thornhill were enough to make the stoutest heart quail, and that he would remember them for the rest of his life. On the Wednesday morning, ventilation was slowly restored. A party of engineers and mine inspectors, including Mr. Scott, descended into the Wheatley seam just before midday. What they found stayed with them forever. Lifeless bodies covered in soot, grouped in silence. Some appeared to be sleeping, others were frozen mid-prayer. One man was still kneeling, chalk in hand. On the side of a minecart he had written, "Goodbye, Betsy, love. Do your best. From your loving Tom. God bless us all. Tom." The chalk was still clutched in his hand when they found him. What's interesting is that many of the dead had travelled some distance after the explosion. They had tried to get out. Few had been burned, most had died from the afterdamp, suffocated by the very air they breathed. Dead ponies were also found collapsed in the tunnels. Now, I was lucky enough to be shown this underground plan of the Combs from the archives at the National Coal Mining Museum. Each black dot marked a survivor, and each red cross a body. Thankfully, just after 3:30 p.m. on the Wednesday, a rescue team found someone alive. The news spread like lightning. People at the pit started crying, shouting, praying. For the first time in a very long time, there was hope. In total, 9 men had survived, but not all of them would live to tell the tale. Joshua Ashton died just hours later, and John Hayward passed away on the Thursday night, despite being carefully nursed. In the end, 139 men and boys were lost. Only 7 had survived. Those who did make it out were later taken on a seaside break, an attempt to help them recuperate after the trauma of being entombed underground for over 30 hours. It's quiet here now, peaceful still. You'd never know by standing here today that this churchyard once had a week where over 100 coffins came through its gates. This churchyard was packed so densely with crowds that even the gravediggers had to stop work. Here, funeral after funeral was held, one after the other, as the people of Thornhill buried their dead. Many of the men and boys laid to rest here weren't just names on a list. They were sons of this parish, third, even fourth generation miners, baptised in this church, married in this church, and now buried just beyond its walls. Their ages ranged from 12 to 70. The funeral costs, the coffins, the carriages, even the journeys to churches across the district were all paid for by Mr. Ingham, the mine's owner. It was a gesture of responsibility and perhaps of sorrow, because how else do you even begin to make things right? On the days of the funeral, the Thornhill brass band, made up mostly of miners, played the Dead March as they laid their friends to rest. One of the hardest stories to hear is the story of Benjamin Milnes, who was just 22. Now, Benjamin was due to get married on the following Saturday. He'd already bought a house for him and his sweetheart. He'd decorated it, he'd furnished it. No doubt the pair were really, really excited. And unfortunately, Benjamin and his father and his brother were killed in the Combs Colliery explosion. And he was buried on the same day that he should have been getting wed. There's an even sadder part to this tale, and that is that the wedding cart that was due to take him and his bride to the church actually ended up taking Benjamin here to his grave. There were so many dead, it became a logistical challenge. The Thornhill Parish magazine described how on the Friday the churchyard became too crowded to continue digging. They made the decision to close the gates to all but funeral parties on the Saturday. From morning to night, for more than 8 hours, the burial service was repeated. The bishop himself came to take part in the ceremonies, and one by one they were laid to rest. By 8:15 that evening, 110 miners had been buried here at St Michael's. The rest were buried in other cemeteries throughout the area. Now, in the days that followed those burials, the mourning turned to questions, and those questions demanded answers. An inquest was opened here in Thornhill just a week after the explosion. What happened in that pit? Why did it happen in a pit that was supposed to be safe? And could it have been prevented? The inquest was held on the 11th and 12th of July at the local board offices in Thornhill. Edward Ingham, owner of the Combs pit, appeared in person. He told the committee that every part of the pit had been explored. He knew exactly how many men had gone down that day, and he knew exactly how many were lost. He based the figure on the number of lamps recovered and by other means. Then, in front of the room, he was said to have broken down, sobbing like a child, head in his hands. Now, one of the men that got up at that inquest, he'd actually seen the original Combs pit get sunk, and he stated that no expense had been spared and that the Combs was really considered a very safe pit. People who don't know about mining, he said, tend to think something wasn't done, but I don't believe that's the case. And then Mr. Ingham cried again. One man who did know about mining, though, was Frank Wardle, Her Majesty's Chief Inspector of Mines. He gave a very clear conclusion. In my opinion, every one of the 139 lives was lost by suffocation, smoke and afterdamp. Not a single life was lost by fire or force. The gas, though minimal, had ignited at the shaft landing near the Wheatley seam. It was almost certainly a naked paraffin lamp that caused it. The ignition lit the gas like a trail of gunpowder. The flame reached a hidden feeder behind the shaft's brick wall where methane had collected, unnoticed. It caused a small explosion and then a fire that burned for hours. There had been warnings. It had even happened in the Easter before, and at that point the naked flames were drawn, but within a couple of days they were brought back out again. Yes, the Combs pit disaster had once again brought the country to ask the question about the dangers of mining. But naked lights would remain legal underground well into the 20th century. The Industrial Revolution brought progress. It powered a nation, it built wealth, railways and cities, but it came at a cost. The stories in this series aren't easy to hear, but they should be remembered. For the children who never grew up, the miners who dug deep to build an empire, the women left to raise children alone, and the communities who carried on quietly and resiliently. Their voices echo in the seams of Yorkshire. Let's make sure they are not forgotten. A full roll of names has sadly never been fully verified, but plans are underway to create a permanent memorial, I'm told. If you know of someone who was lost in this disaster, please share their name or their story in the comments below, so more of us can remember and recognise them too. Now that's the end of this video. Thank you to everybody that's watched. Thank you to everybody that's watched the full series and come along from the Husker Pit disaster to the Oaks disaster to finally the Combs. Together we've been able to remember them, and if you have enjoyed this video, please share it so that their stories can be spread further and wider. Now these are just 3 mining disasters that have happened in Yorkshire. There are many more, and there were many more throughout Britain. But our country is littered with stories like this, and unfortunately I do not have time to tell you them all. So please allow me to, in this series, at this final end, remember everybody that has died as a result of mining tragedies in this country and overseas. Now I've been Claire, this has been the Wanderlust way, and if you just take a second to remember the men and the boys of the Combs Colliery with me. Thank you.